Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking our first look at Intel's 13th gen Raptor Lake mobile processors by thoroughly benchmarking the Core i9-13950HX, which is just about the fastest laptop chip that Intel has ever made. Earlier this week we checked out the new GeForce RTX 4090 laptop GPU from Nvidia, so if you missed that, go and check it out to see how this generation's fastest GPU fares. But today it's time to look at CPU performance. Raptor Lake for laptops is very similar in its overall design principles to Raptor Lake for desktop. It takes the basic architecture of older Lake we saw last year and beefs it up through an enhanced Raptor Cove P-core with more L2 cache, higher clock speeds and faster memory support. The E-cores haven't been left out either, with Intel throwing more of them into the picture for some models, especially at the high end. Like with the desktop Raptor Lake lineup, not all 13th gen mobile processors use the new design with Raptor Cove cores. For example, the Core i7-13700HX is basically just a refresh of the older Lake Core i9-12950HX from last year. But the Core i9-13950HX is new. It does use Raptor Cove and increases the overall core count to 8 P-cores and a whopping 16 E-cores. This HX series part, again like we saw from HX processors last year, is basically the flagship desktop Core i9-13900K repurposed for a laptop and with more laptop appropriate power limits. In addition to 24 cores and 32 threads, the 13950HX brings clock speeds of up to 5.5 GHz on the P-cores and 4 GHz on the E-cores, plus 36 MB of total L3 cache. The integrated graphics solution is very weak though, just 32 execution units clocked up to 1.65 GHz, which is indicative of how this laptop chip is designed to be used with discrete graphics. The default power limit is set at 55 watts long term, though some laptop designs will increase this substantially if they have the cooling power available. Given that the 13950HX is basically a desktop chip put into a laptop, it's naturally positioned as a high-end CPU for big gaming and workstation machines. That's really where we expect to exclusively see the new 55-watt HX series parts. For other types of notebooks, Intel has the more traditional Raptor Lake H series at 45 watts with fewer cores. The 13900HK has 6 P-cores and 8 E-cores, as well as low-power P and U series models. There are legitimately so many new Raptor Lake mobile chips that it's going to be impossible to test them all, so we're hoping to touch on a few select models throughout the coming months. For testing the Core i9-13950HX, we have the MSI Titan GT77, which also features an Nvidia GeForce RTX 4090 laptop GPU at 150 to 175 watts, 64 GB of DDR5 4800 memory, and a 4K 144Hz mini LED display. This laptop has a ton of cooling power, so by default it runs at quite a high CPU power level in some workloads, which is very useful for our power scaling numbers that we'll be showing later. It's quite rare to see laptops able to sustain over 130 watts of CPU power though, so for most of this testing we are using our normal power normalized setup that assesses performance at the base power rating, in this case 55 watts, as well as 75 watts, which is a common boosted power level that most laptops can achieve. Turbo power has been left unchanged. However, I should note here that while I received a Titan GT77 that uses the 13950HX, actual shipping retail units will use the 13980HX, which is basically the same CPU but with a slightly higher single-core turbo frequency. Starting with Cinebench R23 using base power and the Core i9-13950HX is very impressive at a 55 watt long-term power limit. The addition of 8 more E-cores relative to the 12900HX does boost multi-thread performance substantially at the same power level, giving us a 46% higher score in this workload. This has generally been the case for many laptop CPU generations now. More cores clocked lower is more efficient than fewer cores clocked higher, so when power constrained, the more core solution is able to deliver better overall performance. This is very strong scaling given the CPU has 50% more cores. When increasing the CPU power limit to 75 watts for all parts, the margin between 13950HX and 12900HX remains pretty similar at 42%. Both parts scale well to higher power levels, and clearly this new Core i9 part is preferable for high power, high performance multi-thread workloads. In R23 single-threaded tests, the gains are naturally a lot lower, as the general P-core architecture is quite similar between 12th and 13th gen. The main difference here is a higher single-core clock speed, jumping from 5.0 to 5.5 GHz, plus more L2 cache. I recorded around 10% better performance here, which is right on what is expected given the clock speed difference. This continues to give Intel a very strong lead in single-thread performance compared to AMD's Ryzen 6000 processors, although AMD is about to launch new Zen 4 parts shortly. In handbrake, the 13950HX was 33% faster than the 12900HX at base power. This allowed Intel to push past the two previous leaders in this workload, the Ryzen 9 5900HX and Ryzen 7 6800H, making it the outright winner by a very solid 25% margin. The 13950HX was less strong at 75 watts with a 25% lead on the 12900HX, but nevertheless this is still a very decent gen-on-gen performance increase for software-based video encoding. Most people are probably going to use Blender's GPU rendering these days with parts like the RTX 4090 laptop GPU, but CPU encoding is still a good multi-thread stress test. Here the 13950HX in the open data workload ended up again 45% faster than the 12900HX, which is a great result thanks to the additional 8 E-cores. For Chromium code compilation, the new 13950HX was, you guessed it, 45% faster than the 12900HX and 12900HK, which were basically tied in this workload. It's clear that multi-thread CPU-bound tasks like this are the main area where Raptor Lake is able to outperform Alder Lake by a significant margin, which is good news for those looking to buy a new laptop this year, as GPU performance has also increased substantially, so you're looking at a double whammy for better performance. At 75 watts in this workload, the 13950HX's lead wasn't as amazing, but still beat the 12900HX by 36%. So it seems the 55 watt numbers are a bit more favourable to 13th gen and may highlight some efficiency improvements. MATLAB is a short burst workload that is very memory and single thread sensitive. While the 13950HX is the fastest CPU I've tested so far in this benchmark, it's not hugely faster than its predecessor, just a 6% gain. With that said, Intel's high IPC does lead to a domination of other processors here. Basically, all the top CPUs in MATLAB are Intel. In our Microsoft Excel number crunching workload, the 13950HX performs strongly, but not as strongly here as in other multi-thread tests. It did come in 24% faster than the 12900HX, which is decent, and like in MATLAB, this gives Intel a very large lead over the nearest AMD CPU that we tested. I expect this gap to close in a few months once Zen 4 arrives. UL Pro Scion's Office Benchmark tests productivity performance across the full suite of Microsoft apps, and here I didn't see any notable performance gain for the 13950HX versus 12900HX. The two 12th gen Core i9 systems I tested were actually slightly faster, but close enough to not make this a significant lead either way. Raptor Lake loves 7-zip, so we're getting quite a large performance increase. In the compression test, it's 31% faster compared to the 12900HX, which again keeps Intel in the number one position comfortably for now. The gains are even larger for decompression, where I recorded a 43% performance increase relative to the 12900HX, which matches some of the earlier results for benchmarks like Cinebench and Blender, so very impressive stuff here. Adobe Photoshop is a very single-threaded benchmark, and I actually didn't see any performance difference here between the 13950HX and 12900HX, which was a bit of a surprise. But I triple-checked these numbers, and indeed the new 13th gen part is a bit slower than the old 12900HK. This could be related to very weak iGPU performance, which at times Photoshop relies on. Not sure, might need a bit of further investigation. The 13950HX was quite impressive in FL Studio, exporting a track 36% faster than the 12900HX, which was surprisingly weak in this workload using base power. The margins compared to the 12900HK were smaller at just 26%, but that's still a substantial increase in performance gen on gen at the same power level. The combination of a new i9-13950HX and RTX 4090 laptop GPU wasn't as advantageous in Adobe Premiere as I expected. Looking at the overall score, the new flagship contender was just 7% faster than our previous leader, though this was affected by slightly lower live playback performance. When we isolate the export score, we see a 15% improvement and a 21% improvement for effects. This possibly isn't as high as some other benchmarks, as Premiere utilizes hardware encoding, which hasn't increased in performance this generation. After Effects benefits from increased single-thread performance to end up 9% faster than our previous best result in this test, which is in line with other lightly threaded results we've seen. A similar result in Agisoft Metashape for this mixed workload compared to previous generation laptops. Gaming performance is very difficult to isolate with the 13950HX, as laptops using this processor are likely to feature much faster graphics as well. We saw the RTX 4090 laptop GPU being over 50% faster in GPU limited scenarios relative to the RTX 3080 Ti laptop, so any gaming benchmark comparing 13th gen to 12th gen is very much not apples to apples and could be influenced by a substantial GPU improvement. With that said, I think there is some value in looking at the most CPU limited benchmarks we have, so let's go. In CSGO at 1080p using lower settings, the new flagship 13950HX configuration was 26% faster in terms of average performance, which is definitely an impressive result for one generation in a largely CPU limited game. Age of Empires 4 wasn't as impressive though. Here using medium settings at 1080p, the new 13950HX laptop was just 6% faster than our previous 12900HK system with the RTX 3080 Ti, and actually regressed in 1% low performance. Not a particularly awesome result that would have you upgrading when CPU limited. Rainbow Six Siege performance at 1080p using medium settings is very high, averaging over 350 FPS, which is plenty in this title. The 13950HX ended up 15% faster than our 12900HK configuration, so a modest gain. In Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p using the low preset, I saw no performance difference between the 13950HX and 12900HK, and only a small improvement relative to the 12900HX. This game is clearly fully CPU limited under these conditions, and the best I could say is that 1% lows are 8% higher on the 13950HX. In the very CPU demanding Hitman 3 Dartmoor benchmark, we saw a modest performance improvement of 14% at 1080p, comparing this new flagship laptop to a previous generation flagship, incidentally both from MSI. 1% lows rose by 14% as well, which seems to be around the average result of what is possible from this generation. We've also discovered recently that games such as Far Cry 6 are hugely CPU limited at 1080p, even using ultra settings on a modern laptop. The upgrade to a 13950HX and RTX 4090 laptop GPU only brought about a 5% increase in performance on average relative to a last-gen flagship, although in this game 1% lows did increase by 15%, which is more notable. Next up is power scaling. The Core i9-13950HX is hands down the most efficient laptop CPU I've tested so far, and currently the best overall, even at low power limits like 35 watts. While the margin at a relatively low power level isn't amazing relative to other parts, this is an area that the 12900HX struggled with, as it was actually less efficient than the 12900HK and only regained the lead at higher power levels. While we haven't tested the 13900HK to compare to the 13950HX, the new HX model is starting off from a more solid footing that puts it above Ryzen 6000 and the Apple M1 Pro. Power scaling in general is very similar to the 12900HX, but at a much higher efficiency level overall. You can see why Intel set a default TDP of 55 watts here, as performance doesn't scale very well at power levels below this, while the gap to other CPUs is typically maintained at higher power levels up to 95 watts, which is shown in this chart. Between 55 and 105 watts I'd say is the sweet spot here, although high levels of performance are possible above 105 watts just with diminishing returns. For example, going from 55 to 75 watts, the score increases by 18% for 36% higher power. But going from 105 watts to 145 watts gives us just a 12% gain in performance from 38% more power. It's also important to note that not all laptop designs are capable of running the CPU at 145 watts of sustained power. In fact, it's incredibly rare. As an example, the previous HX laptop I had to test was from Gigabyte, and that topped out at 95 watts sustained on the 12900HX. So while it is possible for the 13950HX to perform about 33% better again at 145 watts versus the 75 watts we showed in some of our benchmarks, that may not be a realistic level of performance in a laptop you may be considering. And yes, looking at wall power usage, even at its default 55 watt configuration, the 13950HX uses a lot of power, more like 66 watts sustained after subtracting idle power. And just look at that boost power. Wow, the GT77 is really capable of pushing this thing to crazy levels for a very short period of time. Meanwhile, single thread performance was actually a bit surprising, with a lower level of power consumption than my 12900HX unit, perhaps suggesting that some optimization has occurred. Maybe I also have a well-binned model, not sure. Lastly, I want to briefly touch on battery life. I wouldn't recommend buying a Core i9-13950HX system for use on battery, as at least with my MSI model, not only does battery life suck, it also reduces performance on battery by around 33% using Windows 11's best efficiency mode. Looking at the PC Mark X application's battery life test, I only saw a small increase in stamina per watt hour of battery capacity comparing this 13th gen part to 12th gen. The 6800H unit from AMD I tested a while back is significantly better in terms of battery life in this test. But this sort of system isn't really designed for long battery life, as crazy as that sounds for a laptop. This sort of workstation / gaming chip is meant to be used plugged in. Overall, I've been quite impressed with the Core i9-13950HX, and I'm glad to see a strong jump in performance from Intel's Raptor Lake processors this generation. This follows the strong gains we saw from 12th gen versus 11th gen, so it's quite possible to see nearly double the performance compared to Intel laptops from just 2 years ago. The areas where the flagship 13950HX are most impressive are with multi-threaded performance and overall processor efficiency. Compared to the 12900HX, this new 24-core model is often upwards of 35% faster in heavily multi-threaded workloads, with the addition of 8 more E-cores working well here under the power constraints of a laptop. This gives the 13950HX a substantial increase to performance per watt, even though in most systems I suspect this CPU will be run at quite high sustained power levels like 75 watts or even 100 watts. Buyers will be happy to know that at say 100 watts, this is still the most efficient part that I've tested. Aside from very impressive multi-thread improvements, don't expect too many gains elsewhere. Raptor Lake is around 10% faster for single threading thanks to higher clock speeds, but this is less of an improvement than we saw with older Lake. Gaming performance, while hard to separate due to huge gains in GPU performance this year, is also only somewhat faster when CPU limited and not a major selling point to 13th gen compared to 12th gen. But the overall package here is certainly worth considering, especially as a workstation system. Even with slimmer gains to lightly threaded performance, the 13950HX is still 30% faster than the best Ryzen 6000 or 11th gen mobile CPUs I've tested. So anything other than 12th gen could be worth upgrading from, especially with those aforementioned gains in GPU performance. After years of stagnation, it's great to see Intel back at it with decent speed improvements these last couple of releases. I'm also pleased to see that the Core i9 this generation is genuinely giving buyers an upgrade, whereas in previous years the Core i9 was little more than a slightly higher clocked Core i7. The 13950HX has more cores than any Core i7 model from the 13th gen. Something like the 13700HX is now equivalent to a 12900HX from last year, which we showed to be quite a bit slower. So for once, at least with the HX series, not so much the regular H series, but the HX series, there is a reason to spend that bit more on a Core i9. With that said, I would strongly advise holding off any laptop purchase from a CPU standpoint until we see AMD's new Ryzen 7000 mobile processors using their Zen 4 architecture, which is set to launch within the next 2 months. Ryzen 7000 is looking to be quite a substantial upgrade, which is why I didn't spend much time in this review comparing 13th gen to Ryzen 6000. Those older Zen 3 parts are set to be superseded very shortly. Once we have the performance data in for Zen 4 laptops, we'll have a much better idea of which laptop family is worth buying this generation. On a more negative note, I was disappointed to see that the efficiency gains for the 13950HX don't translate very well at all into a good experience on battery. The 13950HX is no slouch on battery, but it does lose a lot of performance when not plugged in, and battery life is terrible on these big, beefy gaming notebooks. I'd like to see a renewed focus into making a really excellent high-performance experience on battery, because that's really what a laptop should be, a great system to use on the go. These sorts of machines are a lot less compelling when they have to be plugged into a wall 100% of the time to be useful. There's also the issue with pricing. This year's laptops are looking to be especially pricey, but it's hard to comment too much when we only have RTX 4080 and 4090 laptops so far. The cheapest Raptor Lake HX Core i9 laptop I've seen has been around $2,500 US, but it's possible we'll also see this CPU used for RTX 4070 systems, which is set to arrive later this month. I'm not expecting it to be cheap to get this level of performance, but I just don't know how it compares to other options in this new lineup at such an early stage and with so few laptop models released at this point. So yeah, probably see further comments on that in future content. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you're interested in supporting the channel, we do have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts, links in the description below. So if you like our independent testing and want a couple of cool extra bonuses like our Discord chat or monthly live streams or behind the scenes videos, then Patreon and Floatplane is a great place for that. Also consider subscribing to Hardware Unboxed. Haven't said that in one of my videos, but yeah, subscribe if you like this sort of laptop content. In the next coming months, we are expecting to take a look at, say, those Zen 4 chips from AMD. We've also got RTX 4080 laptop GPUs coming in, probably RTX 4070 and maybe 4060 as well soon. So take a look at all that stuff, and if you subscribe, you won't miss a thing because it'll be in your inbox. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.